Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here. Let me remind you that if you like the videos that I do, please go ahead and like and subscribe. And obviously, if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do all of this in my free time, so any amount of support can help me bring more of this content to you. Today for TCG Tuesday, I decided to cover yet another deck tech. It's another Boros deck. I know last week we did Fire Song and Sunspeaker, which was kind of a Boros Spellslinger deck with the concept of using Fire Song's ability to give red instants lifelink and then using big board wipe, instants and sorceries, my bad, but using big board wipe cards like Blasphemous Act or Star of Extinction or X spells to try and take advantage of that in the best way possible, and follow-up plays with things like Aetherflux Reservoir and nonsense like that. This deck is going to be a little bit different. This deck is more focused on the commander damage aspect of things, so we're running Feather the Redeemed, and while this deck is relatively easy to build, I did want to go through what I put in here and the reasons why, and kind of touch on it. I know that we are ever closer to Streets of New Capenna that comes out on the 29th of April. On the 22nd we should be receiving our secret layers. The specific one that I'm looking for is Heads I Win, Tails You Lose, which I will be doing a video on as well. So not next week, but the week after, you should see a Heads I Win, Tails You Lose deck tech, and the week after that you should see the new Streets of Capenna spoilers. Well, I guess it's not spoilers, it'll be released by then, so check for those. And without further ado, let's take a look at what we got here. So for starters, we are running Feather the Redeemed, and essentially what we want to run in here is a lot of instants and sorceries, because whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets a creature you control, you exile that card instead of putting it in your graveyard as it resolves, and if you do, you return it to your hand at the beginning of your next end step. So essentially recycling all kinds of instants and sorceries. So like I said, we're going for the commander damage, so this has it's reminiscent of Voltron strategies, except that we're not using equipment to do it. We're just going to use a whole bunch of instants and sorceries over and over again to try and outpace our opponents. So let's take a look at what we have, starting with the creatures. At the very top, we have ourselves an Arcane Crusader. So despite the fact that we are focusing specifically on trying to get Feather in play and just dealing the commander damage, not all plans work out the way we expect them to. So we also have to load this with creatures that also interact with instants and sorceries. This is a good example. Arcane Crusader says, Heroic, whenever you cast a spell that targets a Arcane Crusader, create a 1/1 red soldier creature token with haste. And this actually works out really well with Feather in play, because Feather doesn't necessarily have to be targeted herself, it just says a creature you control. Next up, we have Annex and Simede. They're a legendary creature, human soldier for 3/3/2, first strike vigilance. Also has heroic whenever you cast a spell that targets Annex and Simede. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. So if we're trying to go for a much more creature-heavy aggressive strategy, this Annex and Simede really helps to bring that around. Next up, we have Birgi, God of Storytelling. This one is actually in here for other reasons. It's flip side, but before we go into that, whenever you cast a spell, you can add a red mana to your mana pool. Until end of turn, you don't lose mana as steps and phases end, and creatures you control can boast twice during each of your turns rather than once. So that last part, we're not really going to be paying attention to. There is actually, I don't think there's any creatures in here that boast. This top part, however, whenever you cast a spell, it adds a red mana to your mana pool, can help out really well. But what we're really looking at here is the back part, and let me just pull this off camera so I can flip it. We're looking at the Harnfeld Horn of Bounty. You can discard a card to exile the top 2 cards of your library, and you can play those cards this turn. So essentially, if you have something in your hand that's just not working out, or you need more oomph to whatever play you're about to do, this allows you to discard a card, exile the top 2 cards, and if any of those cards fall within that instant sorcery situation, not only can you cast them that turn, but because of the text on Feather, you're going to receive them back into your hand even though they were exiled to begin with. So it's just a really good combination between the two cards. The other important thing to understand is that there is an extremely high amount of instants in this deck. Not so much in the way of sorceries, I think there's 6, but there are quite a few instants in this deck, so this really does help bring that to life. So pull that off. Birgi, God of Storytelling. Next, we're going to have Electrostatic Field. It's a 0/4 defender for 2. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So we're going to slowly ping our opponents just because we're casting spells. We're doing exactly what we want to do, and we're penalizing our opponents at the same time. Next, we have Firebrand Archer, 2 for a 2/1. When you cast a non-creature spell, Firebrand Archer deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it's the same concept here, except that this also encompasses enchantments and artifacts as well. So every time we're playing those, doing exactly what we want to do, we're also doing incidental damage on top of that. Next, we have Gutter Snipe, 3 for a 2/2. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, Gutter Snipe deals 2 damage to each opponent. So again, the Electrostatic Field, except extra damage on top of that. Then we have Kessig Firebreather. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Kessig Firebreather deals 1 damage to each opponent. It's the same thing as the Firebrand Archer, except its stats are slightly different. The Firebrand is a 2/1. This is a 1/3. Then we have Mavinda, Student's Advocate. Flying. For 0, you can cast a target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard this turn. If that spell doesn't target a creature you control, it costs 8 more to cast. If that spell would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. Activate only once each turn. So this essentially allows you, especially if you're playing the Harnfeld Horn of Bounty, I believe it's called, to get those cards that you discarded back to your hand by recasting them, targeting a creature you control while Feather's in play, and then putting it back into your hand because it doesn't actually hit the graveyard. It gets exiled via Feather's ability and then returns to your hand. So that's one way of getting your cards back. Another thing is that if Feather isn't in play and you're forced to play some of your instants and sorceries, this is a great way to recycle those, especially if you put Feather back in play to get them back into your hand. Next up, we have Mirrorwing Dragon. 5 for a 4/5, flying. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Mirrorwing, that player copies that spell for each other creature he or she controls that spell could target, and each copy targets a different one of those creatures. This could be bad and good. If your opponent casts a kill spell, he could pretty much essentially wipe your board. Well, actually, I guess wipe the board. However, with this deck, anytime I cast any of my instants and sorceries, since they all target, I'm pretty sure, most of them target, this would allow you to target him and then target literally everything else you have on the field. And because, again, it's targeting, if Feather's in play, it's just going to return it back to your hand. Next, we have Monastery Monk. Monastery Mentor. It's 3 for a 2/2, and it has prowess, so every time you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to put a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess onto the battlefield. So it's a one-man army. If all your strategies are failing and you happen to have a Monastery Monk or Mentor in hand, you can literally create an army of 1/1 monks with prowess. And since the deck itself is just based on casting instants and sorceries, those creatures are going to get huge every turn. And this is one way you can swing wide if your opponents do not keep you in check. Next, we have Phalanx Leader. 2 for a 1/1. Has Heroic. Whenever you cast a spell that targets Phalanx Leader, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So just another backup strategy for the deck. We got Storm Kiln Artist, 4 for a 2/2. Storm Kiln Artist gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. And whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, you create a treasure. This is super good in this deck because, as I've mentioned with Boros decks before, specifically Firesong and Sunspeaker, it's really hard for red and white to ramp. So any kind of ramp they can get is super invaluable. So in the case of Storm Kiln Artist, every time we do what this deck wants to do, we're creating treasure tokens, and it's getting slowly but surely bigger for every treasure token we have in play, not to mention the rocks and so on and so forth. Next we have 10th District Legionnaire. 2 for a 2/2 haste. Whenever you cast a spell that targets 10th District Legionnaire, put a +1/+1 counter on 10th District Legionnaire, and then scry 1. So it's a good way to filter through your deck for things you need. Gets +1/+1 counters, so if it's left unchecked, it gets really big. Does exactly what the deck wants to do. Next we have Vanguard of Brimas. 2 for a 2/2 Vigilance Heroic. Whenever you cast a spell that targets Vanguard of Brimas, put a 1/1 white cat soldier creature token with Vigilance onto the battlefield. This is another one that's very similar to the Mentor, except slightly worse, where we're just going to create a whole bunch of tokens and try and swing wide if we can't get our strategy to work. Next we have Young Pyromancer. 2 for a 2/1. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/1 red elemental creature token. This one isn't quite the same as the other two. While you could use this one to create a whole bunch of tokens and swing wide, this is really just to create a bunch of chump blockers so that you're not put in a situation where you might die easily. And then I believe last but not least, we have Zada Heteron Grinder. Zada Heteron Grinder is 4 for a 3/3. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Zada Heteron Grinder, copy that spell for each other creature you control that spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. So it's essentially the same thing as Mirrorwing without the downside. And again, it would benefit off the Feather trigger. So it's just a really great card to have in this deck. Next up, we're going to look at the instants, and as I mentioned, there are huge amounts of instants in this deck. It is the highest amount of cards in this deck. So you can see right here, this is all just instants. Starting from the top, we have Adamant Will. Target creature gets +2/+2 and gains indestructible until end of turn. So we're getting the pump effect and we're getting the indestructible. So if for whatever reason Feather gets targeted out of turn, or if you're in the middle of combat and Feather gets targeted, we can make her indestructible instantly. Super good card, and because it's an instant and it targeted a creature you control, it'll simply get exiled and returned to your hand at the end of the turn. Next up we have Ajani's Presence 1 with Strive. Ajani's Presence costs 2 and a white more to cast for each target beyond the first. We're only going to target the one target. Any number of creatures you control, target creatures you control, each get +1/+1 and gain an indestructible until end of turn. So this is Adamant Will, except it costs 1 less. It gives 1 less +1, and it still gives the indestructible. You can also use the Strive ability to make it target other things, but with Zada and Mirrorwing, you might not need to. And really, honestly, since our focus on Feather, we don't really necessarily need to do the Strive part. It's really in here because it costs 1. Next, we have Apostle's Blessing. 1 in a Phyrexian white mana. Target artifact or creature you control gains protection from artifacts or from a color of your choice until end of turn. Just a great way to protect Feather, and it comes back to your hand at end of turn. Bandage, prevent 1 damage from to any creature or player, and draw a card. So this is another one of those where it's in here because it costs 1, it targets a creature, and you get to draw a card. It's not really going to save Feather, although it definitely could. Really what we're trying to do is draw more cards to give more possibilities for instant sorcery buffs. Next we have Blacksmith's Skill. 1 white, target permanent, gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. If it's an artifact creature, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If for whatever reason it ends up being an artifact creature, for sure you get that +2/+2, but really what it's in here is the hexproof and indestructible. to make it untargetable. You'll notice that a lot of the white cards in here are about making it indestructible or untargetable, so we can keep Feather on the table because it will become a target. Next up, we have Boros Charm. Boros Charm doubles for its indestructible and for its double strike. So right now, since we're going for this idea of pumping up a single creature really big and then swinging in for commander damage, having double strike is really incredible. And because it targets, it'll allow it to return to its hand. However, if you use it for the indestructible part, which is possible, you will save your creature. However, it's not targeting anything, so it will end up in the graveyard. That's where Mavinda comes in. Next, we have Brute Force. 1 red to give target creature +3/+3 until end of turn. Just a straightforward +3/+3 buff. Then we have Chaos Warp. Chaos Warp is part of our single target removal. 3 so that the owner of target permanent shuffles it into his or her library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it into the battlefield. Essentially getting rid of a possibly big threat, and maybe they whiff and don't get anything back. And if they do get something back, hopefully it's nothing more than like a land or a useless artifact. Next, we have Cloud Shift. 1 white, exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under your control. This is a budget version of Teferi's Protection. Only targets 1 creature, but because it targets, it will get returned to your hand at end of turn as long as Feather's in play, and it saves whatever creature is being targeted. Next, we have Crimson Wisps. Crimson Wisps is 1 red, target creature becomes red and gains haste until end of turn, and you draw a card. So really what we're doing here is using it for the draw card effect, but if you just put Feather in play, this is a great way to give it haste and swing in. Next we have Defiant Strike. 1 white, target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and you draw a card. Next we have Eerie Interlude. 2 and a white, exile any number of target creatures you control. Return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So there's 2 reasons it's in here. First off, it is targeting creatures. Secondly, it's targeting multiple creatures. So it's, again, very much like a budget Teferi's Protection. And thirdly, because it's targeting, it's going to get returned to your hand. So you essentially have this 3-cost creature protection in your hand indefinitely, and you can actually use it. It says on you control. Never mind, you can't use it on your opponent. Next up, we have Expedite. 1 red, target creature gains haste until end of turn. Draw a card. So another one of those ways to swing out with something that just came into play, and you get to draw a card. Then we have Fight as 1 white. Choose 1 or both. Target human you control gets +1/+1 and gains indestructible until end of turn. And target non-human creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains indestructible until end of turn. I don't think I need to repeat it. We're just here for protection. We have Fist of Flame. 1 and a red. Draw a card until end of turn. Target creature gains trample and +1/+0. for each card you've drawn this turn. So this is doubling up with the cards in here that allow you for 1 mana to draw a bunch of cards. So you're drawing a whole bunch of cards, and then you play a Fist of Flames to just buff a creature really heavily. Then we have God's Willing. 1 white, target creature you control gains protection from a color of your choice until end of turn. Scry 1. So we can set up our next turn, and we protect our creature. Next, we have Guided Strike. 1 and a white. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. Draw a card. Path to Exile. For 1 white, you can exile a target creature, and the player that controls it gets to search the library for a basic land and put it into play tapped. Next up, we have Psychotic Fury. For 1 and a red, target multicolored creature gains double strike until end of turn. Draw a card. This one is obviously specifically targeting Feather, but there are other multicolored creatures in the deck. Maybe 1, 2 other multicolored creatures. So essentially, you were just trying to get that double strike effect, and you get to draw a card. Next, we have Semet Sprint. For 1 red, target creature gets +2/+0 or +2/+1 and gains haste until end of turn, and you get to scry 1. So again, setting up, giving haste, giving a pump. Seijiri Shelter is in here for 2 reasons. For 1 and a white, target creature you control gains protection from a color of your choice until end of turn, so we get that protection. Also, if you're short on lands, which sometimes happens, you can actually just use the other side of this for planes, basically. Next up, we have Sheltering Light. For 1 white, target creature gains indestructible until end of turn, and you can scry 1. Next, we have Shelter. For 1 and a white, target creature gains protection from a color of your choice until end of turn, and you get to draw a card. We have Soul's Fire. For 2 and a red, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to any target. So now we can double up on the attack effect. So we pump it up really heavily, we swing into somebody, dealing commander damage, and then we use Soul's Fire to have it deal damage equal to its power to another person, which is commander damage. Next up, we have Sudden Breakthrough. For 1 and a red, target creature gets +2/+0, gains first strike until end of turn, and you create a treasure token. Again, I can't talk about ramp enough in red-white. This is one of those extra ways to get some ramp in there. Swords to Plowshares. For 1 and a white, exile target creature its controller gains life equal to its power. Temur Battle Rage. For 1 and a red, target creature gains double strike until end of turn, and it has Ferocious. Target creature also gains trample until end of turn if you control a creature with power 4 or greater. So if you cast a couple of buffs on the creature, or actually in the case of Feather, who's a 3/4, you only actually have to cast 1 +1/+0, and the Ferocious comes online. Next we have Titan Strength. For 1 red, target creature gets +3/+1 until end of turn, and you get to scry 1. And then finally, we have Unleash Fury. For 1 and a red, double the power of target creature until end of turn. So those are instants, and again, they're just in here to buff up, preferably Feather, and just swing in for huge amounts of damage. Next, we're going to look at the sorceries. I was wrong. There's close to 10 sorceries. Alright, starting with Ancestral Anger. For 1 red, target creature gains trample and gets +X/+0, where X is 1 plus the number of cards named Ancestral Anger in your graveyard. So basically just +1/+0. But you get to draw a card, it only costs 1, and it gets trample. So, hey, still good. It's a sorcery, unfortunately. Next up, we have Angel Fire Ignition, probably the best sorcery in this deck. For 1, a red, and a white, you get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. It gains Vigilance, Trample, Lifelink, Indestructible, and Haste until end of turn, and has Flashback, which the Flashback doesn't matter. It targets, so it's just going to get returned to your hand. It is probably the best sorcery in this deck. Then we have Chandra's Ignition. For 3 and 2 red, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. So this is kind of cool because it can form as a board wipe, but it also targets a creature you control, which is exactly what Feather is looking for, and since it's a sorcery, it is also what Feather is looking for, so it just comes back to your hand at the end of the turn, which means that you have this board wipe, imminent board wipe in your hand for as long as Feather remains in play that your opponents have to worry about. And because it deals damage to each creature and each opponent, it is actually pretty deadly. Next up, we have Explosive Entry. For 1 and a red, destroy up to 1 target artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature. So this is in here kind of experimentally. I'm probably going to keep it, we'll see. It can destroy an artifact, which is great, and it can give a +1/+1 counter to a creature. The best part about this is that it says up to 1 on both instances, so it doesn't necessarily have to destroy a creature to be able to be, an artifact to be cast, and it doesn't necessarily have to target a creature to be cast either. It just has to, or it just has that ability. Next, we have Feldmighty. Destroy all creatures with power greater than target creature's power. So this is another one of those, you get rid of anything bigger than Feather. We have Reckless Charge. This is one that I might take out as well. Target creature gets +3/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. Has flashback for 1 red. It's in here for the 1 red sorcery thing. It gives +3/+0 and haste, which is great. I'm still trying to figure out if it's worth keeping in here. Next, we have Renegade Tactics. Target creature can't block this turn, draw a card. So you can cast this on your own creature, specifically Feather, during or just before combat, since you're not blocking on your turn anyway, so that you can get that card draw, or you could just use it on your opponent's creature and eventually bring it back with Mavenda. Either way, it stops something from blocking. If they have a flyer or multiple flyers, this is a great way to get around them. Next, we have Ryle for one red. Ryle deals 1 damage to a creature you control. That creature gains trample until end of turn, and you get to draw a card. It's not the best card, but it's also not necessarily the worst. And finally, we have Seize the Day. For 3 and a red, you can untap target creature. After this main phase, there is an additional combat phase, followed by an additional main phase. So you pump up your Feather really heavily, you swing in, and then you follow up by playing Seize the Day during your second main phase, so that you can swing in again for, X amount of damage. Very good card. Next up, we're going to take a look at artifacts. And big surprise, I'm using Aetherflux Reservoir in here. We are going to be gaining life here and there. There are ways to give lifelink and gain life, especially with Aetherflux Reservoir specifically. So this is not in here in the same capacity as it is in the Firesong and Sunspeaker, because in Firesong and Sunspeaker, we're going to gain copious amounts of life. I have tested it. It does work. In this one, it's really in here as if your final opponent is within kill range, this will do the job. It's not meant to take out 3 players like it is in Firesong. Next up, we have Arcane Signet, 2 for your commander ident. Next, we have Boros Signet, 2 for filter red-white. Commander Sphere, 3 for commander's ident, and you can sacrifice to draw a card. Soul Ring for 1 for 2. Then we have Sunforger. Sunforger in here, just like it is in the Firesong and Sunspeaker, but I think in here it is definitely more viable and much more useful. It gives equipped creature +4/+0, but you can unattach it for red and white to search your library for a red or white instant, or no, it's definitely just instant, with converted mana cost 4 or less, and play it without paying its mana cost. So you can search out by unattaching it for any protection spell that you need to keep your Feather alive. Next, we have Swiftfoot Boots. It's in here to protect the creature, but specifically we chose Swiftfoot Boots instead of Lightning Greaves, which there will not be any Lightning Greaves in here, because Swiftfoot Boots give hexproof, whereas Lightning Greaves give Shroud. Shroud prevents you from being able to target your own creatures, and since this deck is so heavily based on targeting your creatures, it is actually counterintuitive. Next up, we have Talisman of Conviction. 2, you can tap for a colorless, or you can tap for a red and white. If you do, you deal 1 damage to yourself. We have Thought Vessel, 2 for a colorless, and it takes away your maximum hand size. We should be drawing beyond our maximum hand size by the mid to late game, so you need some way of keeping those cards in your hand. And then lastly in there, we got Wayfarer's Bauble. It is in here for the ramp. Again, red-white has trouble with ramps, so this just allows you to get that ramp in there. Next, we're going to take a look at enchantments. There are only 3 enchantments. First off, we have Arya of Flame. 2 and a red. When Arya of Flame enters the battlefield, each opponent gains 10 life. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a verse counter on Arya of Flame, then it deals damage equal to the number of verse counters on it to target player or planeswalker. So, again, the idea behind this deck is to cast a whole bunch of instant sorceries, and Arya of Flame just takes advantage of that at such a great in such a great way. Yes, when it comes into play, your opponents gain 10 life. Now, you should be able to rob them of that 10 life within 2 turns. just by casting instants and sorceries and swinging it. Not to mention, we're not here to deal 40 damage. We're actually here to deal commander damage. So you're only looking to deal 21 damage to your opponent with Feather specifically. So Arya of Flame giving them 10 life doesn't actually save them from that demise. Needless to say, if for whatever reason you choose not to do the commander damage way, you're still going to burn through that extra 10 life super fast. Next up, we have Fighter Class. For 1 red, 1 white, whenever it enters the battlefield, search your library for an equipment card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle. Obviously, we're looking for Sunforger. I believe that's the only equipment in the deck. You can level it up for 1, a red, and a white, and equip abilities you activate cost 2 less to activate, so now the Sunforger only costs 1 to equip. And then finally, for 3, a red and white, you can level it up to level 3, and whenever a creature you control attacks, up to 1 target creature blocks it this combat, if able. Really, what we're doing it for is the fetch. We got to search for that equipment and then make it cheaper. Just because we're going to be equipping and unequipping it a lot. This final part is just a way to get rid of things, or forcibly make them block to get rid of things you don't want on the field. Last, we're going to run Monologue Tax. Now, originally, I had run Smothering Tithe, and I had switched this out for Monologue Tax, and I put Smothering Tithe in my blue-white birds. Now, if you remember, I was talking about my blue-white birds, and I had wanted to test a Monologue Tax in there, and Monologue Tax was just not keeping up. The deck needs the extra treasures from Smothering Tithe to really get that ramp going, just so we can keep up with counters as we need them. And also, some of that deck can get really expensive, so it's just a nice way to keep up. Well, in here, it was kind of the opposite. Smothering Tithe was too good. I was getting so many treasures, I didn't know what to do with them. And this deck isn't built to have a huge amount of responses, and since the responses are between 1 and 2 mana apiece, it just wasn't necessary to have that many. So I am trying it out with Monologue Tax. Whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, you create a treasure token, because we don't need the amount of treasure tokens that Smothering Tithe brings us, but we do still need to create treasure tokens. So I want to see if Monologue Tax makes it a little bit more manageable. I'm not purposely trying to gimp the deck. If you want to run Smothering Tithe, you'll probably see the same thing I kind of ran into. The best part about Monologue Tax is that your opponents can't pay to stop you from getting the treasures. Next, we're going to look at lands, starting with the non-basic. Yeah, there's no Planeswalkers in this deck because we really just don't need to focus on that. If I was going to put a Planeswalker in here, I would probably put Jeska Thrice Reborn. The only problem with that is that because Jeska is not my commander, it would basically just happen 1 time to deal 3 times the damage, and it's just really not worth it. So for starters, we got Battlefield Forge, which is the red-white pain land. We have Boros Garrison, the red-white bounce land. Clifftop Retreat, the red-white check land. Command Tower to get that color ident. Fabled Passage, fetches. Needle Verge Pathway, which is the MDC red-white. Reliquary Tower, just another one of those you have no maximum hand size. Rugged Prairie is a red-white filter land. Sacred Foundry, red-white shockland. Spectator Seating, red-white crowdland. Sundown Pass, another red-white checkland. Temple of Triumph, red-white scryland. And Windscarred Crag. Windscarred Crag. Red-white tapline that gives life. And then last but not least, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 mountains. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 planes. So that's the deck. This is Feather. It is specifically built as a Boros Spellslingers commander damage type deck. There's a couple ways here where you can get really out of hand if unchecked. It really puts the pressure on your opponents because 21 commander damage is so much easier than 40 damage in total. So it becomes a threat very quickly. If you have any comments or questions, leave those down below. I love hearing from you guys, but let's keep it positive. Any negative comments will be removed. And that's it, guys. Until next time, peace.